Mrs. Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate, and I'm pleased that my first speech on my return to the backbenches should be on this topic, a topic on which I have worked both in opposition and in government, an issue on which I'm pleased to say that the government of which I was a member, both as Home Secretary and Prime Minister, took forward action, building on work that had been taken by previous governments. But crucially, of course, a topic that is of such importance to our society and of such significance. Domestic abuse blights lives, it can destroy lives, and not just the life of the immediate victim, but of those children and other family members as well. And it is imperative. I believe this is a landmark piece of legislation. And I'm very pleased that we have seen, I think, more than 40 members of this House wishing to speak in this debate. That shows the degree of seriousness with which this issue is taken by members across this House. That is a view that is shared across all parties in this House. And it's good to hear of the cooperation and collaboration that there has been, and I'm sure will continue to be, to make sure that we get this legislation right. But of course, passing the legislation is only one step. This is about changing the attitude that people take to domestic abuse. And the challenge for members of this House, the challenge for the government, the challenge for us all, is to make sure that the whole of society takes this issue as seriously as those who wish to contribute to this debate today are taking this issue. As I say, I think this is a landmark piece of legislation. It's a bill that has been described by government and indeed by charities and others involved in working with the victims of domestic abuse as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make sure we take a step change in the approach we take to supporting victims and to dealing with domestic abuse. I'd like, Mr. Speaker, to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, for the work that she did and all the members of her committee did in pre-legislative scrutiny. I think they did that with assiduously, with great care and with great commitment, and that was a very important part of the process of making sure we get this legislation right. I'd also like to thank the charities and organisations who contributed to that and who have continued to push us all on this issue to make sure that we are doing more for the victims and survivors of domestic abuse. And I would like to thank my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, and the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Home Office, who have championed this issue and continue to do so, and have worked so hard to make sure that this legislation comes forward and will be carried forward, because it is imperative that this is not lost and that we are able to see this bill go onto the statute book, because this bill will affect people's lives, it will improve people's lives. And the Lord Chancellor himself referred to the figure of 2 million adults experiencing domestic abuse in the last year for which there are figures. 2/3 of those, of course, were women. Domestic abuse accounts for 1/3 of violent crime. And as one of my other honourable friends referenced in an intervention, it is estimated to cost our society £66 billion a year. This is not something that simply takes place behind closed doors and that others can ignore. It is something that affects us all. It affects our economy, it affects our society, it affects our young people as they are growing up. And one of the saddest, we've heard various comments about experiences people have had, and reference was made from the opposition benches earlier to the issue of young people and their understanding of relationships. I remember as Home Secretary initiating a campaign of advertisements about what a good relationship was. But the saddest thing was reading some of the comments that the young people, particularly young women, made when they had seen those adverts in cinemas and elsewhere. Comments like, "I didn't know it was wrong for him to hit me." This is the sadness in our society of so many people who don't know what a good relationship is and who suffer from that bad relationship and who suffer in silence. For too many, as we've heard, for many years suffer in silence before any action is taken. I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I do think, and I'm awfully sorry, but I'm still tempted to refer to the Right Honourable Lady as the Prime Minister. When I worked in child protection, I had a young mother that I was working with, and she was on a second marriage, and she said to me, "We all expect to be hit by our husbands, don't we? It's just this one's so violent." And it was absolutely shocking, but not half as shocking as when we were later in court, because we were taking wardship proceedings to protect the children. And the husband informed the court that I was lying. There was nothing wrong with their family, nothing wrong with their relationship, and I was just prejudiced. And the judge said to him, "Are you saying that you have never struck your wife?" There's a pause, and he said, "Well, obviously I've given her the odd backhander to keep her in line, but no, I've never been violent." And that is what we are having to combat and deal with. And that's part of what today's debate and this bill must also tackle.
I absolutely agree with what the Honourable Lady has just said. And that's why I say that we will pass, I trust we will pass this legislation. We will pass it in good shape and it will make a difference. But it is only one step. And it is getting that recognition out there of what is right and what is wrong. It's very simple. It is not right to hit somebody in that relationship. But it's more than that, and if I may, I'll just come on to this in a minute, because, Mr. Speaker, conscious as I am of the number of members who wish to speak, I just want to touch on a small number of issues very briefly. And the first issue is one that I think for many people looking at this legislation would feel was insignificant, but is hugely significant, which is the inclusion in statute of a definition of domestic abuse. It is not that long ago that a number of government departments were working to different definitions of domestic violence and abuse. I recall as Home Secretary trying to ensure that we could at least try and get an agreement among departments as to what a definition might be. But having it in statute is hugely important. And what is also hugely important is having a definition which goes beyond what most people, if you ask them what domestic abuse was or domestic violence was, would answer, i.e. physical violence, but actually recognises all the other types of abuse that take place. And I think it is chilling to sit and hear a woman who has been controlled by their other half for a period of time, as I say, often for years. And it happened slowly, and it was difficult to recognise it when it started. But little by little, that control was exercised until that individual's rights as an individual human being were taken away from them. And that is what we are talking about here when we talk about domestic abuse. And so that definition, and getting that definition right, is incredibly important. As the Lord Chancellor said, I hope that others will use that definition when it is in the bill. It's referenced in the bill as the underpinning of the bill, but I hope that others will use that definition and recognise it. The second issue I just wanted to touch on is one that has also been referred to earlier, which is the courts. And I'm sure every member will be aware of cases where, indeed, the Lord Chancellor started his speech with a reference to his case 25 years ago, where a victim of domestic abuse has not felt able to pursue, to give evidence, to go through the steps that are necessary to see the perpetrator being brought to justice. And it is that fear of what is going to happen in the court that is often driving. Not just that, of course, but the fact that the perpetrator may very well be using them, manipulating them in a way to try to ensure that they don't give evidence in a court. I remember asking one case when I was in the West Midlands, when I was Home Secretary, talking about one case, and an IDVA was saying that the woman that almost hadn't turned up, they'd done a lot of work for her to turn up at court, almost hadn't turned up at court, and the IDVA had gone to the home to see what the problem was. And it was very simple. The perpetrator had locked her in a cupboard, so that she couldn't actually physically get to court to give evidence. So we do have to recognise the problems that victims face. And one issue, of course, as has been referenced by the President of the Family Division, is this question of the cross-examination by perpetrators, which can be an extension of, and in some cases deliberately an extension of, the abuse that the victim has suffered from. So having, on the face of this bill, the ability for that to be prohibited, I think is incredibly important. I just wanted to touch on the issue of children. For far too long in this country, we thought that if a child was in the room next door where somebody was being hit or coerced, next door room, it didn't affect them. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think the figure is that a child who's been in a home where there's been domestic abuse is 50% more likely to endure that abuse in a relationship later in their lives. And that's why I said earlier, domestic abuse doesn't just blight or destroy the life of the victim, it does it for those who are around that victim too. And it is important, and I recognise there are pros and cons of how one can look at this issue. But I don't want us to miss this opportunity to ensure that we are properly looking after the needs of children in these who are experiencing in a home where there is domestic violence being experienced. And I would ask the government to make sure that they look very seriously at recommendations that have been made around children, to ensure that, as I say, we don't see a bill being passed into statute and then 6 months down the line people say, why didn't you? I think it's imperative that we look at that. I just want to touch on briefly on two other issues, Mr. Speaker. One is the question of perpetrators. This is a hugely difficult topic to talk about. But actually, if we are going to do what I'm sure we all want to do, I'm sure actually we would all prefer not to be having the necessity of talking about domestic abuse legislation because we want to eradicate domestic abuse. But if we're going to, we're very far from that, but if we're going to get to that point, we have to ensure that we deal with perpetrators. We talk a lot about supporting victims, and that's absolutely right. But finding a way of ensuring that people do not become perpetrators in the first place, or where they are perpetrators, they cannot continue to perpetrate that domestic abuse, is hugely important too. It's very difficult. Talking to organisations that work with perpetrators, finding the interventions that are going to have the best impact is hard. I will give way to my right friend.
I think she's making a really important point about perpetrator programmes. And I think she would agree with me that we have to be very careful here to make sure that the programmes are tested and are the right programmes, because we do not want to make the problem worse.
My friend has made a very valid point and an important point, and that's why I say this is a difficult topic. Sometimes it seems hard to talk about working with the perpetrators, but it is important that we identify the programmes that work. Yes. And it won't be a one-size-fits-all. I think this was a point that the Joint Committee made when they very welcomely looked at this issue. And so it has to be done carefully, but we shouldn't shy away from it. Because if we're going to ensure that we that we do see an end to domestic abuse, we have to deal with perpetrators. But that goes alongside issues like education about what a good relationship is, so that we see this, these sorts of behaviours being stopped at the first sign rather than being allowed to continue. And then the last point I wanted to make is, some might say slightly tangential, Mr. Speaker, to the bill, but it refers to, I want to talk about the police. I think there has been a huge amount of work done with the police to train them in dealing with domestic violence. There are many developments that are very helpful. Body-worn video cameras, for example, that can actually ensure that the film is taken when they turn up to a reported incident, so that there can't then be somebody saying, oh, well, actually, no, it was okay, nothing happened. That evidence is hugely important. The ability through the use of technology for a police officer attending an incident to know in advance whether that's somewhere where there have been reports of domestic violence or domestic abuse in the past is also an important element of that. But, and I'm sure others will have had this experience, of domestic abuse victims talking about the fact that if they get a police officer who's been well trained, it works well. But actually, when you report an incident, it's the police officer who's on duty, who is on the response unit, who comes out. And often those do not have the same experience. So I think we need to look at that very carefully. And we need to do something else. And this was a point that was made to me by one of the people who'd been involved, I think, who'd been involved in one of the charities dealing with victims of domestic abuse. Police forces need to look at how they deal with domestic violence and domestic abuse within the force, where police officers themselves are subject to such domestic abuse. And if they turn a blind eye, then that gives a message to their officers as how they should treat people outside the force who are reporting abuse. This is an aspect that I don't think has really been focused on previously, but we should focus on it. And we should be encouraging police forces to ensure that they have, within their forces, the means properly to support those officers, because there will be police officers who themselves are the victims of domestic abuse. And we need to ensure that forces have the ability to support those police officers. This is, as I say, a hugely important bill. It will be subject to very close scrutiny, I know, during the committee stage. There is so much that is good in this bill. There are obviously issues which the government is being asked to look at again, to make sure that we get this in the best shape that it can be. But I say to, as I said earlier, to everybody across this chamber, passing this legislation is but one move. It is up to all of us to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make clear to our society, to the public, the horrific nature of domestic abuse, the impact it has on people's lives, and the need for us as a society to say, stop it. Yeah.